I think it is clear that we can expect great things from you. After all, he who must not be named did great things. Terrible. Yes, but great.
Not Slytherin, eh? You could be great, you know. It's all here in your head. And Slytherin will help you on the way to greatness. There is no good and evil. There is only power. And those too weak to seek it.
Genesis tells us that in the beginning, God made all things, and they were good. But if you want to end up in heaven forever with the maker of all things, it's crucial to keep this point in mind. Just because something is good in general doesn't mean it's good for me right now. The focus of the last talk was on whether or not Harry Potter was sinning whenever he used magic, and we concluded he wasn't because, well, it's natural to him, unlike when we try and use magic. This talk is going to focus on the issue, should a Catholic read Harry Potter? Now, it might be tempting to think, well, if Harry's not sinning and using magic, of course there's going to be no danger whatsoever in reading about it, right?
Be very wary. You could just lose yourselves along the way.
One of the biggest complaints that various critics had about the Harry Potter series was that it might lead young people to the occult. Even Pope Benedict, when he was still Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, warned about this possibility. Now you might think that, well, the Cardinal spent a little too much time locked up behind the Vatican walls. He doesn't really know how things go here in the real world. But not too long ago, MTV's website had a story about some young pagans who practice witchcraft of various sorts. It said a surprising number of young witches MTV News spoke with also said they became curious about their faith through misguiding pop culture fare like the Camp Neve Campbell vehicle, The Craft, and the Harry Potter series. And they threw in this line, just for good measure. Guess a few conservative Christian groups were right about that one. So we need to start this discussion by acknowledging that, yeah, Harry Potter has led some young people to the occult. Now, there are probably many factors involved, but that Harry Potter had a role is undeniable, and we just have to accept that. So how did old Pope Benedict know that this children's fantasy series might actually turn some people onto witchcraft? Well, I think the answer is that Pope Benedict is someone who understands the human heart. He wrote to one German critic of Harry Potter, "It is a good thing that you clarify the case of Harry Potter, since it contains some subtle seductions that work in depth and with great effect, and that corrupt young Christians in their souls even before they are fully formed." The use of the word subtle here is really important. Temptation is often least effective and sometimes even counterproductive for the one doing the temptation when it makes a big show about being evil. And
Why suffer an horrific death when you can join me and live?
Never!
And it's most powerful when it appears to be most good.
Would you like to see your mother and father again? Together. We can bring them back.
To understand how exactly magic can tempt us, it's important to look and get a handle on this idea of pride. The temptation to pride is a temptation to excellence, and the Latin word for pride, superbia, looks a lot like superb. St. Thomas Aquinas said that pride is aiming higher than one ought. That might seem impossible at first. I mean, aren't we supposed to try to be the very best we can be? Well, sure, but pride is not about perfecting ourselves. Pride is about rejecting who and what we are and trying to be something we're not meant to be. In some of the Harry Potter characters, most especially Lord Voldemort, we see how this pride corrupts and destroys someone from the inside out. The first ingredient of Voldemort's pride is his false idol, power. Power is what he relentlessly pursues, and he shares this love with his pupils. Voldemort doesn't ask, how much power should one person have? Are there good or bad ways of getting power? None of that stuff. Voldemort decides what he wants to be, instead of trying to figure out how to perfect what God has already made him. In the very first book of the Bible, Genesis, God tells Adam and Eve that they're in charge of the Garden of Eden, and there's only one rule: no eating from the tree in the center of the garden. If you eat it, you'll die. So along comes the serpent, who tells Eve two things. One, you certainly will not die, and two, God knows that the moment you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you shall be like gods, who know what is good and what is evil. Gee, I wonder what happens next. The woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. And the rest, as they say, is history. Now, Voldemort, like Adam and Eve, made the decision to pursue power that he had no right to. This basic act of pride leads us to a second and somewhat odd characteristic of pride. We come to hate the truth about ourselves. Voldemort's hatred and fear of death, the ultimate weakness, is bound up in this dynamic. Catholic author and blogger Mark Shea put it rather succinctly: death is the last impregnable fortress against our pride, the last reminder that sin cannot win, that our power is not eternal, that God is not mocked. The reason Voldemort hates death is that it reminds him of the truth that he is not God. And this hatred of the truth is really a hatred of himself and of the weakness that he knows, deep down, he possesses. J.K. Rowling said that Voldemort's name is derived from the French, which means flight from death. But if we go a little deeper, what he is really flying from is the truth about himself. This should all make a certain sort of sense. If you idolize something, like power over death, that isn't a part of who you are, then you're going to hate yourself for not having that. And this is in sharp contrast to Simeon in the Gospel of Luke. He's a very old, very humble, very holy man who is promised by God that he will not die until he has seen the Messiah. When Mary and Joseph take Jesus to the temple to be circumcised, Simeon is led by the Holy Spirit to them, takes the child Jesus in his arms, and says, "Now, Lord, you may let your servant go in peace, according to your word, for my eyes have seen your salvation." Simeon's trust in God allows him to face death with peace in his heart, an attitude that should remind us of the third Peveril brother, who asked death for a cloak of invisibility.
Only when he attained a great age did the youngest brother shed the cloak of invisibility and give it to his son. He then greeted death as an old friend and went with him gladly, departing this life as equals.
Besides hating the truth about ourselves, a third characteristic of pride is that it also leads us to love ourselves for all the wrong reasons. This is why Voldemort and the Death Eaters are so concerned, even obsessed with being purebloods, even though many of them, like Voldemort, aren't.
Surely you didn't think I was going to keep my filthy Muggle father's name.
But what our ancestors were doesn't determine what we are now. The Malfoys think so highly of themselves because of their money, which is even more ridiculous than being obsessed about blood status, because it tells us nothing, absolutely nothing, about who they are, only about what they have.
Red hair, vacant expressions. Tatty, second-hand book. You must be at the Weasleys.
And the apples don't fall too far from the tree.
Red hair and a hand-me-down robe. You must be a Weasley. You'll soon find out that some wizarding families are better than others, Potter.
By highlighting differences that don't really matter, like money, the Malfoys escape for a little while from the truth that, at the end of the day, they're just as human as everyone else. So let's review our observations about pride thus far. It involves worshiping some sort of idol. It leads us to hate the truth about ourselves, and consequently, we start loving ourselves for all the wrong reasons. But we still haven't addressed Cardinal Ratzinger's idea that there might be some subtle seduction to magic. In fact, after everything we've just heard, we might make this idea seem ridiculous. I mean, given how pride corrupts and how awful it is, who would want to be Lord Voldemort? Where's the subtlety in that seduction? The trick here is knowing where the temptation will come from. Voldemort is not going to tempt us, hopefully. His evil is very obvious and hideous. But remember that temptation, in order to be effective, needs to drink what I call the moral polyjuice potion, to disguise itself as something good, which means the temptation to magic is not going to come from our villains in the story, but from our heroes. So how does this work? First, there's the fact that Harry is not necessarily sinning every time he uses magic, because as I explained in the first video, this sort of power is natural to him. It's built in. And my hunch is that most people sort of intuitively get this idea. The second step of any sort of subtle seduction could come when we look at the heroes of the books, Harry, Dumbledore, Hermione, McGonagall, and we want to be like them. And who wouldn't want to be able to go toe-to-toe with the darkest of dark wizards and fight the good fight, as Dumbledore or Harry did? It's something awesome and exciting. Now for the third step, where the real temptation comes in. Instead of wanting to imitate their courage, their quick thinking, their love for others, we instead begin to desire their power. Gosh, if only I could be as powerful as Dumbledore, then I would do so many good things for people. Wanting to do good things for people is good, but look at the subtle seduction that's already there in what I said. If I had power, I would do good things. So why am I not doing good things with the power and the abilities that God has already given me? So the first subtle temptation of reading the Harry Potter series is that we might want to focus on the magical abilities of the good characters instead of the virtues that make them the good characters in the first place. As I mentioned before, Voldemort nurtured this love for power, but at the same time, this resulted in a growing hatred of himself, a hatred that eventually resulted in a bad makeover and even a rejection of his given name.
I fashioned myself a new name, a name I knew wizards everywhere would one day fear to speak when I became the greatest sorcerer in the world.
The second subtle seduction of pride is a similar hatred of the truth about ourselves, the key word here being subtle. None of us is perfect, and it is good and healthy to want to be all that you can be. This requires that we be honest about our faults and sins and weaknesses, and work towards positive change and true conversion. But when we conceive this desire for magical powers in our hearts, we get distracted. We forget to look at our real faults and instead pretend that the real problem in our lives is that we don't have magic. We ignore the truth about ourselves because pride has led us to unconsciously hate that very truth. Pride can blind us, which is why the Dursleys, who hate magic, are still impervious to the truth about themselves. Their little Dudders is just seen as the nicest little boy, even though he is clearly a spoiled brat, an all-around jerk. The desire for magical powers can play a role in this by misdirection. When life isn't going as we want, when we aren't happy, magic can distract us from looking at our own selves and asking what needs to be fixed in our own minds and hearts, and instead tempts us to look at our own lack of power. Over time, we get in the habit of ignoring the truth about our faults and failings, and into the habit of fantasizing about having real power. Eventually, we acquire a hatred for the truth. The third subtle seduction that magic can work on us is a temptation to hate or hold in contempt those who remind us of the truth about ourselves. Bullying provides a good example of this. Picking on someone who is seen as weaker or less cool, whatever, creates an artificial separation between the bullies and the bullied. So it's a result of the bully's pride.
Beat up another 10-year-old?
This one deserved it.
Yeah.
For those who are hurt by bullying, pride can tempt them to dabble in magic for two reasons. First, because then they can curse their enemies and use this sort of newfound power. But that's not a very subtle temptation, and you clearly lose the moral high ground. So I think it is actually less common than the second temptation, which is that people would pursue magic precisely because they want to feel special, to be a part of a select group, to have a power that sets them apart and makes them worth loving.
Associating with muggles. And I thought your family could sink no lower.
I think this is what many critics mean when they call the Harry Potter series Gnostic. Gnosticism was a heresy that developed in the 2nd century after Christ and was made up of numerous groups with widely ranging ideas, but they're all put together though because they all thought salvation came through knowing various secrets or mysteries of the universe, and not because they did things like, obey the commandments, or love the Lord your God with all your heart, or take up your cross daily. You know, the stuff that Jesus actually asked for. Gnosticism appeals to our pride by offering us admission to an elite circle, those who really know what's going on. And magic can work in precisely the same way. Now, as one of my Dominican brothers likes to say, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the Harry Potter series actively encourages us to use magic. I'm not saying it was written to tempt us. However, that's the tricky thing about evil, is that it takes something which can be good in itself, and it twists it to its own purposes. So Harry's world is a lot like our own world, even if it is different. And we are fallen people who are tempted to pride, and so caution is needed. When even MTV is admitting that the Harry Potter books have led some people into practicing real magic, it needs to be taken seriously. Another inconvenient truth is that temptation is everywhere, and we need to be prepared to deal with it, not always run from it, because that's simply not possible. So I think there are two things we can do to help us enjoy and learn from the Harry Potter series, while also resisting the temptations towards magic and pride. First, we simply need to see temptations for what they are. They lose a lot of their power that way. Secondly, we need to have a good understanding of virtue. I hope you'll join me in my next talk when we'll focus precisely on this thing called virtue and what it means for Harry and for us. Please visit preachingfriars.org to see all my videos. Thank you for watching, and remember to read lots, pray more, and keep the faith.